moderator for the day. Greg?
Thank you, Michael. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to week, depending on where you are in the Western world, week 8 or 9 of quarantine, and living in this brave new world, which will hopefully end soon, of only working from home. As you can tell for the occasion, that I've worn a jacket and tie just to dress up for this, and I'm delighted to have a set of panelists here today to talk about what the future of work looks like in a post-COVID-19 world. Because I think as Michael framed it well when we were describing the session, you know, that one of the phrases that has entered the lexicon in the last few months is the notion of the essential worker. And of course, many of those who are deemed essential are also some of the most precarious workers in our societies. And so I'm delighted to have Jan Simpson from the Canadian Union of Postal Workers who's going to address that. We've heard a lot about, you know, the notion of, is this the moment from working from home? And we're going to hear from Manish Ketrapal from Cisco to talk about this brave new world. Clive Wilkinson, who is, of course, best known as one of the world's foremost designers of offices, will hopefully defend why we will want to go back to an office. And then Jamira Burley from the Global Business Coalition for Education will talk a bit about what we can expect from education going forward to this, a form of work. But obviously, we're hearing some of the same debates about, do we need universities? What kind of education? How will that look like? Face-to-face versus remote, and much, much more. So with that, let's get started. And I want to address my first question to Jan, because of course, you know, we've learned so much in the last 8 to 9 weeks about, you know, what it means to be an essential worker. And I would point out that, you know, before this crisis washed over many Western societies, your union won a sort of regulatory ruling to be able to organize dependent contractors, such as the food delivery gig workers for Foodora here in Canada. For those who don't live here, I'm in Montreal and Jan is in Ottawa. Foodora announced that rather than deal with the unionization process, it pulled out of the country as of midnight last night. And so with that backdrop, and also with the fact that once again, the state of California is suing Uber and Lyft over classifying its drivers, misclassifying them as independent contractors. We've seen protests from inside and retaliatory firings from Amazon workers demanding better PPE. We're seeing this sort of, you know, this, this sort of a regulatory crackdown, and also sort of anger from workers about the fact that being branded essential is not getting them better pay or more respect. And I guess as the first question to you, Jan, is what is your union doing on this front? And, you know, how are you intending to carry forward this moment, you know, in terms of, being the first union in North America, as far as I know, to have won the right to organize gig workers? What could the next few years or even decade look like when it comes to organizing, you know, these independent workers? Come on out of mute, Jan.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, everybody, for coming on today to be part of the webinar. I want to acknowledge that I am on unceded Anishinaabe territory. And, you know, Greg, it was a really sad day last night for all the gig workers and everybody within the organizing community and labor movement on a whole. We watched, you know, a multinational company whose parent company, Delivery Heroes, is making hand over fist money that they're pulling out and declaring bankruptcy here in Canada. The foodsters, who were the couriers who worked for Foodora, like you said before, they had the right to, and they won the Ontario Labour Relations Board challenge that Foodora put forward to the right to organize. And that happened on February 25th, 2020. And it changed the landscape of how gig workers, you know, saw themselves and saw how they're going to be able to work. The employers could no longer take advantage of these workers and keep on making money and profit off of their backs and not taking care of their health and safety. As you said earlier on, these workers were deemed essential workers during the pandemic. And at this time, you know, they were delivering to people's homes food to allow them to help flatten the curve and stay inside, but still also help the local economy flow by means of having takeout food. But Foodora didn't provide these workers with any personal protection equipment, no gloves, mask, or hand sanitizer. CUPW took that on to help them out with that as well. And also when they were delivering to people's homes, there was no low contact or no contact delivery option available to these workers. So they were putting themselves at risk every day when they were going to deliver stuff to the customers, as well as they began delivering pharmaceuticals as well for Foodora, because, you know, people couldn't go to the pharmacy as they would have before. So at that time, these workers again didn't know whose homes they were delivering to. Somebody could have had COVID, somebody could have had another ailment. But at CUPW, we're not going to give up the fight here whatsoever. You know, as we all know, Foodora has filed for bankruptcy in the bankruptcy court, and we're going to do our best to ensure that these workers receive the monies which they are entitled to and the money which they deserve, and make sure that they're put on the creditors list as who the employer has to make sure a priority to pay as well. And as you know, in Canada, we have the Canadian Emergency Relief Benefit Plan. And we're also going to ensure that these workers are able to access these funds wherever possible. And we've actually, they have a website called foodstursunited.ca, and I encourage you to go to that website. It has a way you can donate funds as well as actions which we can all take to reach out to the employer, Fedora, as well as Delivery Heroes, to the government as well. Because there needs to be a bigger conversation around the gig economy and the independent contractor versus the dependent contractor model. And many of these employers try to go through these loopholes and try to take advantage of these workers. A lot of them are precarious workers, undocumented workers, racialized workers, women, and young workers. So they're creating a race to the bottom. And CUPW and other unions feel by organizing, we're going to have the ability to change the platform of how we see the gig economy work. And it's important that we have multi-union conversations with the government and even with community allies as well to work together to put forward a platform for post-COVID. CUPW has a plan called Delivering Community Power, which we utilize around how we're going to change and do a just transition. And I feel the gig economy will definitely be part of our plan of delivering community power. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you for framing that. We'll return to many of those ideas, and particularly the notion of, I mean, the trend of course the last few decades has been sort of the atomizing of work and workers. And so it'll be interesting to think about how that also works as we'll move to the next part of the discussion here about knowledge workers working from home, et cetera, and some interesting bridges there. It was as Amazon's revealed where, they have executives in Amazon Web Services resigning in solidarity with some of the protesters. But I want to go for the moment to Munish here because, I imagine corks must be popping at Cisco over the last 9 weeks in the sense of the brave new world here of, mass video over the internet that Cisco has predicted for years now of, and the sort of work from anywhere future, which, Cisco's push with WebEx is finally here as well. And so I guess one question is what does it actually feel like now for you to be working from home for 9 weeks here? But also more seriously, this is something that Cisco has tried to do internally for years in its own office environments. And I'm curious about what you're hearing from customers and also, will I get used to this Zoom burnout? Like, what does this actually mean for workers? And how much work should be done virtually? Because right now we went from 4% for knowledge workers who are working from home, telecommuting, and now we're at 100% close, at least for that subset of the niche. So I'm curious, what's your takeaways to date here?
Sure. So, Greg, I think from a knowledge work and as a technology company, for us, remote working from home, mobile working has always been a normal. It's been something we have been doing from early 90s. So if you think about information superhighway, the whole concept of information superhighway is that users can access any information, anything from any place and work from any environment, right? That's the whole concept. The question is, why was remote worker not prevalent, and why did it not get adopted as fast as it should have? Because this trend has been there for 25 years. The technology has been there for 25 years. The whole work concept needs a remake, if you think about it. And for us, this is a new normal that's being created where work is now officially an activity and not a place. We are working every day, all of us are, at least in the knowledge economy. And as it's blending into the other industries, we are starting to see that new normal come out. And what we are starting to define this as a hybrid work environment. And the new normal is going to be hybrid. And what that really means is that if you think about a city hall, or you think about the emergency operations, or you think about logistics and warehouse, they're not going to go away. You still have to move goods. You still have to drive policy. You still have an environment where you're going to have an official working place. But do all people in any organization, do they need to 100% of the time work from where they're working? And I think that is going to change. And that's going to change with three different, there's several aspects in remote working: the social, economic, emotional, and psychological, and all of those things are there. But if you simply categorize it, there are three major things that we are looking at. One is, what does the individual do? How does he culturally and socially adopt to that? And can he, even in an environment, can he work from home? Right? It's easy to say you're working from home. If you've got a one-room house with 2 children, how do you work from home and have a video interactive session? So there's some cultural and social aspects of it, developmental aspects of it. We are not used to working from home. A large percentage of the population globally are not used to remote working. So what does an individual do? That's one. The second thing is, what do organizations do about it? What are the economics? What are the processes? How do you drive metrics? How do you drive accountability? How do you move from, you come to from between 9 and 5 and you stay till 6:30 in the evening and say, oh, you're overworking, but now that you're working 24 hours a day. So how do you create this as an activity, and how do you have metrics and measurements? And thirdly, I think this whole remote working has a lot of challenges, but there's a lot of positives that have come out of it. People spend less time on roads. Their mobility, environmental challenges are reduced. Costs for government and enterprises are reducing because you're not going to spend $10, $15 per year if you take a 10 or 15%. You're going to be spending $5 a year or $1 a year for a remote and a mobile worker. So there are benefits that are emerging. So what is the funding? What are the rules and regulations we're going to look at? So if you think about individuals, organizations, and government, they'll have to start working in tandem to drive this whole knowledge worker, remote working environment. And very simply speaking, we know that most of our big customers that we are talking to, they've realized that productivity is really not being impacted. When you can work remotely, you can work mobile, you can work in shifts, and you can create the social distancing and you can create protection for people, but you can have them over people coming every alternate day. So you can reduce the number of people coming and still keep the overall productivity and still keep the wages high enough so that people can live their normal lives.
Thank you, Manish. I would say the Democratic rebuttal now goes to Clive Wilkinson. And for those of you who are on here who don't know Clive's work, Clive is, of course, one of the preeminent architects of office spaces, and I think most famous for the Googleplex. But maybe his most iconic one, which also ties offices to cities, was his work for TBWA back in the late 1990s that Malcolm Gladwell wrote about, where it literally created an advertising city and used urban principles as a way to think about organizing work. And Clive, I'm sure you've read, as many of us have, that the office is dead, is sort of out there. And to Manish's more measured points, that we should be rethinking the notion of going to the same workplace 5 days a week if we are, the laptop carrying class. Those of us who are privileged to do that. But Clive, I'm curious, what's your argument against this? And I'm curious how you would push back on this idea that the office and structured environments for this type of work is something that should go in the dustbin, or at least drastically reduced. So.
Greg, obviously, I'd be out of a job if the office was dead. And I truly don't believe it is. I think that we have a very fundamental human need to collaborate in person. The amount of information that is exchanged between people when they're physically present is phenomenal compared to how people connect over electronic media. There's so many reasons why we are much more effective in certain areas of work in person. So what I think is fabulous about what's happened in the last few months is we have had this opportunity for the first time ever to have a genuine experiment in remote working. A real one that has disproved, management fears about worker productivity, that really has actually really allowed everyone to understand and believe that remote working can work, telecommuting can work. So yes, I don't think we're going back to the office for the same reasons. And I think that's a really good thing, because I think the office as an institution has been built on sort of rather poor ideas about human collaboration from the beginning. The layout of factories is what informed the first offices, and that sort of pattern of thinking, management oversight in particular, and how workers are meant to be visibly working. I think all of those things are now in the dustbin in a good way. And that for us is liberating. I think we're moving to the office of the future is going to be about personal choice, about I decide I'm working at home today because of the work I've got to do is more suited to that environment. We're going to become agile workers. Not everyone maybe is carrying laptops today, but I think in 10 years' time, laptops will be much more universally accessible to pretty much anyone. The price point is going down continuously. And the functionality is incredible. I'm doing this from a laptop as well, a 5-year-old laptop too. I think Munich made excellent points about the framework within which we're going to approach this new environment. And mostly just this thing of finally transferring a level of choice to people about how they work, I think is going to be the most exciting thing. Yes, offices are going to have to reduce in density in order to cope with social distancing. That's going to be a good thing, because I think the average is in the future, at least in the immediate future, is going to be partial homework, partial office work, in order to keep the density levels down to acceptable social distancing standards. So 2-day week in the office, 2.5 days, maybe 3-day week in the office is probably going to be the maximum over the next year or so. And that's going to be great, because again, there's going to be choice involved. Of course, there's planning that companies are going to have to do about how do they sequence things in a clever way. But I think there'll be participation with people about how that rolls out. And so overall, I'm very optimistic. I think this is a disruptor point. And I personally love disruptor points, because I think it's a way of reframing. It becomes an opportunity to reframe the future.
Thank you, Clive. That's excellently framed. So now I'd like to go to Jamira quickly to basically sort of, again, resolve this sort of tension between remote and in-person in the education context, and obviously your work. I mean, in addition to the fact that parents around the world, or at least certainly again in the West over the last 9 weeks in our timing of this, have had to work from home in many cases, have had to educate from home. There's now, of course, a new wave of discussion about whether the university is obsolete, or whether there'll be a die-off of universities in the United States and across much of the West, because there will be, power law effects, and the rich will get richer, so to speak, there. And of course, there's big fears about, the notion that there will be a COVID drop-off in student learning. So Jamira, I'm curious your take on this as well. What kind of, how do we apply these trends to education? And what is the best way to chart our path forward there when it comes to finding the balance between online learning and hopefully face-to-face learning? And how do we not use this as an excuse to basically gut school resources as part of austerity that comes out of this?
No, that's so true. And thanks again for having me. What I will say is that I'm all for working from home, or at the very least 2 days in the office. That's the millennial in me. But what I will say is that the work that we do around global education was a dire situation before COVID, and has only increased in its sense of urgency after COVID. Prior to COVID-19, more than 260 million young people were still out of school, and the vast majority of young people who are in school still didn't receive a quality education that enabled for them to actually participate in the workforce. Now across the world, we have 1.5 billion young people who are out of school or receiving school online. But we have to remember that online education is a luxury in many countries, and a luxury in even developed countries, right? The vast majority of folks still do not have access to broadband internet, which is preventing them from being able to fully participate in education. And so what we've learned is that over the last few years, there's been a shift in education. I'm happy that Clive mentioned that the workplace was very much centered around a factory structure. What we now know is that the educational institutions were actually structured around the same way, right? Education hasn't changed in the last 100 years. But what we know is that there's a lot of skills needed specifically for the fourth industrial revolution that is going to transform how we should be not only educating young people, but how institutions should look to engage and recruit young people moving into the workforce. And I say that recognizing that more than 40% of employers prior to COVID-19 had a difficult time finding employees with the right skills. And so our work is really trying to understand what are the skills for the fourth industrial revolution? How can employers better equip themselves in enabling educational institutions from teaching the right skills that move young people into the workforce. And so I really think it's important that now as countries, as organizations, as cities start thinking about how they can better create institutions that not only educate young people with the skills that they need for the future, but more importantly, how can they supplement in cases where young people can't go back into the classroom? How can they supplement online learning or TV learning with actual written material, which enables for those young people to intensify their learning? But what I will say before I turn it back over to you is that it's interesting what we've learned about the skills for the fourth industrial revolution, which are mostly soft skills, right? So it's problem solving, critical thinking, things that we automatically for so long stopped teaching young people. We taught them for a test to another test. And so it's really critical that as we think about how folks are moving closer into their homes and maybe staying further away from other people, how do we still teach those social skills at a time where it's even more critical? And I'm sorry for the background noise. That's my puppy who clearly wants to be on the.
I thought that sounded like a chew toy. Thank you, Jamira. I want to go back to Jan before we do the next round of questions, but I'd like to sort of bring it back all the way around to Jan, because we've had the privilege of the last discussions here about focusing on knowledge work and working from home and having that. And one of the things that has been revealed, of course, in this crisis is the inequality inherent in these types of work, where those of us who are fortunate enough to be knowledge workers have been safe in our homes and surrounding areas. And it's been the gig workers, delivery workers, and others who have been forced to risk their health and even their lives in this. And so one question I have there, Jen, I guess is you mentioned the importance of talking to other unions too. How do we increase awareness in the knowledge worker class about these inherent trade-offs and build awareness in favor of them? And we've seen, as I mentioned, Amazon Tim Bray, the engineer, wrote an angry letter of resignation about what he called a vein of toxicity inside of Amazon and its treatment of its warehouse workers, and acknowledged his own privilege as a distinguished engineer and at Amazon Web Services. I'm curious, Jay, if you have any thoughts on this about, how do we elevate these causes, and how can people in these organizations affect change for that? I mean, Uber and Lyft are full of technologists as well, in addition to their dependent contractor drivers. I'm curious your thoughts there. What other efforts you've seen?
Thank you, Greg. I think that, the basic one is the grassroots organizing and mobilizing. We have to have communications amongst each other to hear what can work well and what can be done a little bit better. Sometimes the gig workers, a lot of them do have degrees and the education that people talk about in traditional jobs, and they've chosen to be gig workers. But I think that the priority needs to be having, like community town halls, for example, and webinars such as yourself is having there as well. And CUPW actually opened a warehouse worker center in Brampton, Ontario, where we actually have information sessions there. People can come in and have discussions and hear about the reality of gig workers and warehouse workers in Amazon and Fedora, and even in Uber as well. And the unions we all have websites as well. We have cupw.ca, which I encourage you all to go to later on and visit our website and see the links that we have around organizing and how important organizing is at CUPW, but also for all unions within Canada and worldwide. And we also belong to international organizations such as UNI, Global Union, as Delivery Heroes is a multinational company. So we need to make sure that around the world, we're all on the same page working together, because I mentioned earlier on that in Australia, they also closed shop when a union tried to come in there and to organize these workers. So these companies also have patterns and action plans which they are using, and we have to be smarter than them and organize on the grassroots. And when deliveries happen to your home, take the time to talk to these workers and ask them, how can you help them? Because now we encourage you again to go to foodstersunited.ca. And when you do order food from other delivery companies, ask them, how can we help you? How can we reach out to your employer to make your working conditions better? They've been seen as essential workers during this pandemic, but also their health and safety has to be seen as essential as well, not just their labor. So we need to stick together, go to the websites, have these kind of webinars, visit each other's websites, and have multi-union conversations around what gig workers need from each and every one of us.
Thank you, Jen. I want to remind the audience, we're going to go to audience Q&A very shortly, so I'll prize your questions as well. But before we get to that, since we've heard these various perspectives, I want to take a moment here to hopefully try to synthesize them here, because obviously, being new cities, our question is how will the future work affect cities? I mean, we can go back to read Jane Jacobs' work from The Economy of Cities in 1968 about her argument that, even before agriculture, cities were arguably places of trade and connection and work happening there. And of course, today we fill the cores of our cities with skyscrapers that are effectively there for knowledge work, skyscrapers that are now compromised by our virus. So I guess my question for each, if you want to each tackle this or break off a piece that you like, is what kind of city do we want to build for this post-COVID-19 future of work, and how we should reconfigure it? A question that might be for Clive, for example, offices, we know utilization rates for offices are almost never above 40%. Most of the buildings that we fill our cities with are empty the majority of the time. And Manish, I know Cisco has experimented over time with, creating sort of telework centers out there, and has pushed telemedicine, has worked with various, Songdo and other smart cities, and has thought about how it might materialize services out of the storefront into our homes, for example, which I'm not sure how I feel. And, this ties into some of the delivery work as well. I mean, we might experience a mass death of retail And instead, delivery workers might take on some of that. So, you know, and of course, the same thing with education. You know, there's a discussion that universities should go away. Well, eds and meds have been the foundation for a lot of, you know, city economies, you know, in the United States and North America over the last couple of decades. So yeah, so the question again, how do we want to live? I mean, 50 years ago, Alvin Toffler predicted we would all move to the countryside and work from electronic cottages, which is basically what many of us are doing right now. Is that desirable? Which pieces do we want to keep of that world that we've left behind temporarily and bring with us into the next, and how we might alter that? Clive, I might nominate you to go first, partly with my screen showing you, but also, yeah, that's when I started studying offices, I learned that most offices are empty most of the time, which is interesting to me.
It's true, and I think that paradigm has been shifting for a while. We've been more and more engaged with clients who are talking about agile working and activity-based working, where you don't own a desk. I think the new generations are much more mobile than the older generations. I've been seeing this shift moving for several years now, and I really think 10 years' time, the office is going to be a very different animal. I think owning a desk is going to be very old-fashioned and almost a mark of an out-of-date company. We are in a changing world. I love this idea, though, countryside electronic cottages. I mean, one of the most interesting trends that's been happening on the verges of urban and architectural design is this integration of nature into buildings, and how it fulfills a human need to reconnect with the natural world because we've been so constantly kind of cut off from it. So I think that trend is going to be an important aspect of maybe the rewilding or the greening of cities, which will change the flavor and the nature of them and make them things that actually integrate with the natural environment much more successfully. But people, I mean, I think liberating people to give them choice about how and when they work, the evidence of this period of teleworking is just fantastic. And I'm very optimistic about the change in the city. I think, you know, adapt and alter buildings is going to be the pattern of the future. I don't think we need to be building lots of new buildings. There's much more consciousness about recycling resources in the built environment. And I think so new programmatic investigations in buildings is going to become, especially with this new way in which people are going to be regarding the workplace and the office, is going to actually start to really impact the pattern of cities. And indeed, I think companies and offices need to address the street far more going into the future than they do today. Retail has been the sort of support of street life for so long. That's suffering. Companies that are really living on these streets need to start giving back to these streets and need to start hosting retail-like equivalent activities, coffee shops. It's hosted kind of co-working, guest working, and things like this. So a certain fluidity with where this whole workplace and the street is moving is one of the most exciting things about where we're going, I think.
I want to add a wrinkle to that for our other panelists here to add on to that. Of course, one of the things the office did and a workplace does is it creates structure for your work-life balance, right? That their work is an activity you do for a wage, and then there's something else. And of course, the rise of electronic connections has slowly blurred the line between work and everything else. And then, of course, that raises issues of, I think, of power and control that I want to discuss this too in terms of urban living. Jen can dive in here as well. I mean, so Clive, I was thinking of, I've seen a number of Wall Street CEOs, CEO of Morgan Stanley, CEO of Barclays, say that they won't need all of their office space when this is all over. Like, they can't imagine it, that they will give their employees the freedom and choice. And I think this is how we connected on this, because I'm very suspicious when they say things like that, because what I hear is that they want to take their real estate portfolios off the books, and they want their workers to absorb those costs into their home offices. That there needs to be a level of protections and a social contract with work, this brave new future work as well. So, and the same thing goes, I would, Jamira, to tie you in as well, I've seen a lot of academics on Twitter are very much worried about what this will do to educators and the precariousness of many faculty and teachers around the world and what this can do to them. So Manish, Jen, Jamira, if you could touch a bit upon this before we go into this is, how do we create a social contract for this new world where the blurring of the physical and the virtual of work is accelerated massively over the last few months.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. One, because I think I read that article too, and I was very skeptical. And I was also more surprised when almost 9 weeks ago, my office went offline. I mean, not offline, online, and decided that all the employees were going to work from home. The first question they asked was, what additional support supplies do you need in order to make your homework that much more better? That is not always the case for a lot of folks who are now working from home, and to your point, absorbing those costs. So I do think that there needs to be a social contract to not only identify how do we come to a better understanding of responsibilities versus our work versus compared to deliverables. And I think that's where a lot of our understanding regards to accountability has moved to. But in your comment around cities, we saw the importance of cities. I've always saw the importance of cities since when I used to work for Mayor Michael Nutter in Philadelphia, because mayors have the ability and cities have the ability oftentimes to make extremely shift changes that don't require getting into the political construct of the state and federal government, right? They can oftentimes do a lot of quick changes to improve the conditions of their cities without the additional political drama. That being said, we're in the process of launching a new initiative called Skills Friendly City that asks cities to work in conjunction with business leaders, young people, and community members to redesign how different implications such as public transportation, the environment, to violence, all plays a role on young people's ability to get access to resources and learn the skills they need for the future. And so I think for academia, this isn't just a question that we should ask of, you know, how are they going to lose out? But really, how do we just shift our views of the future and create and realize that there's so much more opportunity for better learning and reaching more people versus only thinking about the opportunities that they had to reach young people in their classroom, the 40 students, and now they have opportunity to reach so many more people with the ability of using technology if we're able to get technology into the hands of all those who need it.
Thank you. Munish, I know you wanted to say something, and particularly since you also work with public sector, I'm curious how you see your customers dealing with that, and also internally how Cisco has dealt with that since Cisco's been doing this a lot longer.
Yeah, so I think we look at this as two dimensions, as the change is going to happen in two dimensions. The first dimension is what type of a worker you're in. Are you a knowledge worker? Are you working in factories and warehouses? Are you emergency and a person who's operating for human and health services, emergency management? There are different types of working environments if you think about one dimension. The second dimension is what do we do in the short, medium, and long term? So we have to look at both these paradigms, and sometimes we try to bring all of this in one dimension, but if you split them across, you start thinking about a systematic way to address this. So the first core concept, and I talked about it earlier as well, work is no longer a place, it's an activity. Right? We can't think about it. And yes, an organization is going to ask that, hey, you start working from home, so now you're not going to use office space and resources. You're going to use your your home to drive productivity and interact with different team members. So that's one aspect of it. But the other dimension is if the cost for an enterprise is going to reduce, and we've seen this in Cisco, and you talked about 40%, 20% utilization. I'm going to save on that real estate cost, move that productivity back into hiring more workers and or keeping wages high. That dimension changes, because now if I can hire more people and drive more productivity by keeping my costs the same and improving over margin, I as a corporation want to start doing that. That's an important essence. So yes, there's going to be some cultural shift. The second piece is how do you handle remote workers, the factory workers? It's easy to say for knowledge workers that we're going to work from home. And literally, my job has not changed in the last three months. So nothing has happened. In fact, I'm probably adding more hours a day than I was ever before. But that's not the case for people who are out in the streets and bringing food to our houses and remote deliveries or emergency operations. What do we do with them? What do we do for them? And I think that's where education will start coming into place. You'll start seeing polytechnics. We're talking about creating skills. Remote working will become part of that skilling capability. So you'll start seeing that in the medium term. Organizations will have to start having processes around not how many hours of work you do, what activities you do, how do you measure people, how do you incent people. Now think about it. If I'm a remote worker a remote mobile worker who's bringing goods to people's houses, I don't have to go back to office for paperwork. I can save that 2 hours a day, go back to my house and complete my paperwork. And that amount of productivity and benefit can be given back to the same workers for retraining. Or we incent them saying, hey, because you're working from home for those 2 hours and finishing up your paperwork, we're going to get a package in 6 months as a bonus that will allow you to improve your office space, give you better connectivity, give you an environment that you can work. So you can start rethinking all of these concepts. And if we start rethinking these concepts, we'll start improving everybody's lives. I like that cartoon that many of us would have seen. Is, we had this whole, the whole concept of digital transformation we talk about, right? And then there's a hammer that hits a box and says COVID-19, digital transformation. So this is a forcing function for us to rethink ourselves and improve everybody's life. And I think if we approach that in a systematic manner from across academia, across corporations, across people, we'll start seeing that improvement.
Well, thank you for that. I would say that might get some interesting discussion from Jan there, because I think you described very eloquently what could happen. And I think whether it does happen will depend at the minimum on corporate culture and hopefully better on regulatory and legal protections as well for some of this to happen. But I want to open it up to audience questions because you've been so patient. And for those of you who are asking, hopefully we will see Jamira's puppy at the very end of the webinar. Stay until the end and there will be a puppy for all of you, I promise. I've seen it in the Q&A and I've seen it in the chat. You guys want puppies. But keep upvoting those questions and keep adding more. The first question I want to ask, and which I think we can repurpose here a bit for Jan and the others. I'd like to hear her first take. But this one comes from Jay Lambrix, who asks, could we convert large amounts of office space to affordable housing, retail, restaurants, et cetera? I'd like to expand that a bit because, of course, one of the things that's happening with work and the rise of delivery is sort of the disappearance of physical retail and storefronts. And I think Barclays has expected 30 to 40% die-off of physical retail in the next 5 years, which is on top of previous predictions about the death of the mall and others. And we've seen the rise of these, so-called cloud kitchens and ghost restaurants, and work that was previously done by frontline workers in cities is now being hidden in the back of the house and being handled by exactly the kind of delivery gig workers that Jan represents. So I'm curious. I guess I'd be curious. Partly, Clive, we can perhaps start with you, or other thoughts about the repurposing of physical space, right? If we no longer need all that office space, what can it be reutilized as? And, what excites you and what gives you pause in this? Because again, we can imagine, filling our high streets with empty storefronts while, all of that work is moved to warehouses definitely diminishes urban quality of life, even if it might, expand convenience for some of us. So I don't know who'd like to take that first. I'd love to hear Jan on this, but, perhaps Clive as well, since it's sort of addressed at you.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I kind of like the idea that corporations, you're occupying these office buildings and seeing their streets sort of deracinated by a retail that's dying, playing a role in reinvigorating those streets and bringing life back into those streets and taking an initiative. As to repurposing office buildings, well, initially, my inclination is there isn't actually going to be a lot of spare space because density issues have to completely change. So it might be a no net change in the short term, where we have half the number of people coming into the office because that's all we can really contain with proper social distancing practices. So initially, probably not a lot of impact. Long term, yes, I think maybe repurposing buildings, especially for residential. The residential component of our cities is the most vulnerable, the most underserved, the one that really is, to my mind, a kind of a political nightmare, because we have a huge need for housing, affordable housing, and we have so many brakes put on it by the cities and in rich neighborhoods and things like that. So if office buildings can get converted, unfortunately they don't naturally lend themselves to very easy conversion, but it's certainly happening. It has been happening in places like downtown Los Angeles. In fact, over the last 20 years, many office buildings, the older type of sort of B-level office buildings, have already been turned into lofts. That's a great trend too, because I personally think the more mixed use we get in a city, the more vibrant a city is. We have to have people living in downtowns. I mean, I think this is a fundamental thing that has really been the major part of revitalizing downtowns in the last 20 years, is the dropping this regulatory kind of separatism between commerce and residential. Anyway, I won't dominate this piece of the conversation.
Well, I would say, Jay, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. I mean, obviously, like, this, the fact that you're now able to organize, dependent contractors in this has been fueled in part by, this huge growth in distribution centers, last mile logistics, and things like this. And I'm curious your thoughts on sort of the long-term growth of that trend, which has been turbocharged by this. I mean, should we be worried that our high streets are going to empty out, and that, in your interactions with these companies, they intend that in the future, everything will be continuous delivery? I mean, that ends up a lot in mobility futurist circles.
Yeah, thank you for the question. No, I agree. I think that, a lot of things we've seen put in place during the COVID pandemic needs to happen as well as during post-pandemic as well. We've seen wages to be increased, calling it hazard pay. It's actually only, what I consider a living wage. We had the Fairness in 15 fight for the past few years in Ontario to get people a proper wage that they could survive on. We've seen in British Columbia where they've turned places, they took up the tent city there and made it into affordable housing for folks who live in buildings and that. So I feel we have the ability after post-COVID to make sure that these workers have dignity as well as a living wage, health and safety in place, and make sure that they have affordable housing as well, because I think, they're saying probably in the next 2 years, we'll have 75% of the population will actually have had COVID. So I think, a lot of time to be able to self-isolate, to help to heal the world is what we need to do. So affordable housing needs to be a priority during the COVID as well as post-COVID, I feel as well. And I think for us organizing in this sector around the warehouse sector, we see, Amazon workers getting COVID right now, not being told for weeks that their coworkers have this disease. And it's unacceptable, and all the online shopping that's happening currently, people are going to your homes. Like the majority of my workers are postal workers. So they come to your home every day to help you stay home, to flatten that curve. And I think it's important that we ensure that what we're saying now, people are heroes during the pandemic, but they also have to be heroes after the pandemic, because they may not have a lot of the high skilled, what the 1% used to have, but the 1% needs us to make sure the world does continue to flow the way how it is. And I want to thank all the workers out there who are actually working during this COVID pandemic and ensuring that the world can heal itself, as we see with the environment healing itself currently right now.
Thank
if I can just jump in for a second.
Sure.
Because I think it's one thing to remember why, if we repurpose many of the office buildings, the reason why coronavirus was able to spread specifically to so fast, and specifically in urban communities where in poor neighborhoods, is because people are so clustered together because of the lack of affordable housing, because of the lack of space. And so we really do think about repurposing office space and enable for affordable housing, but also utilizing it for public consumption. We might be able to spread people out more. So when another coronavirus does happen or another pandemic, we're enabling communities to be able to be healthier and to stop the virus from continuing to spread so quickly.
Thank you. That is a great through line from our very first episode of this series, also through housing and through density last week. I want to follow up with you, Jameer. I want to combine a couple of questions here from Katrina Johnson-Zimmerman. Hi, Katrina. And Susan Fletcher, who both have questions particularly about childcare in school and related to this as well. How do we, Susan Fletcher asked at the end of her question about, particularly for essential workers, delivery, gig, and non-knowledge workers, how can we arrange childcare in school to meet these needs? We've seen in Montreal and New York, for example, the head of the province, the premier here, and also the mayor of New York have emphasized that they wanted to keep schools open or reopen them because of the armature of services that schools provide in many places, whether it's meals or others. And then the other question I believe that was floating around too from Katrina was, it's also like the notion of how can we fix some of the childcare issues? And I guess a way to expand that question for you is how can we think, or are people thinking about education in schools in particular as new kinds of institutions, or how can we expand their role post-COVID to basically sort of extend those further services, especially that we are in many places now in a recession that is bordering on economic depression.
Yeah, that's so true. And first of all, for all the parents out there, bless your heart. I take care of a puppy. I don't know how y'all are actually like teaching people to learn. But seriously, bless your heart. And I think what coronavirus, COVID-19 is really bringing to the forefront is just how important teachers are, and what their responsibility are. And I think that a lot of folks realize that teachers are heroes, should be paid more. And so first of all, if we're going to expand the responsibility of educational institutions to be more focused on childcare, we need to be paying people, teachers more. We need to ensure that they are the institutions are staffed properly, that they have the medical support. We have to recognize that over the last decade, a lot of school nurses, a lot of therapists have been taken out of those institutions. And so I do think that this is bringing to the forefront, how do we ensure that educational institutions K through 12 are properly equipped with the resources to be able to not only educate young people, but provide both the physical and mental support. I do think that over the next few years, or I do think that because of coronavirus 19, in light of what's happening in New York, there is a need to ensure that there's affordable childcare available, not just for those who are working on the front lines, but also just in order for all parents, right? Because the vast majority of parents don't have the proper knowledge to be able to supplement educational instruction for their students. But the problem is there's just not enough resources or enough people who are properly equipped to actually manage that workload. And so that being said, I think there is a need to kind of, one, make sure people who want to go into education see this as an opportunity, that they are going to be appreciated, that they are going to be properly compensated. Because I think a lot of people are leaving education feeling drained and overworked. And so if we want to change that, we have to ensure that they're paid just as much, if not more so, than billionaires, right? And so I don't know if that really answers the question, but I do think that we're in a moment where a lot of people, particularly those who are at home with children and still trying to work a 9 to 5, realize why they need to be advocating for teachers to be paid more and for those institutions to be properly compensated.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes left, so please keep sending in any more questions. I want to direct one to Manish. There was a question, I seem to have lost it a bit here in the chat, but it was particularly about sort of the carbon footprint of remote work and sort of how we preserve that. I mean, this has always been one of the long held advocacy positions, is that a world of remote work obviously would reduce the need for business travel and would reduce the need for carbon emissions through that. But at the same time, going back to that, Alvin Toffler vision of like working in the rural countryside, that also, a world that is much more distributed is one that has, much bigger changes to land use and footprints, and, could fuel sprawl as well. So I'm curious your thoughts on this. I know Cisco's experimented this, imagining, third place workspaces with telepresence and things like this to reduce that. I know it never got much uptake, and I'm curious about whether you think there's no chance for this, of these sort of like, can you create these digital garden cities or things like this? What are your hopes for this, of how do we keep the best of density and remote and also lower our commute times to the center of cities, perhaps?
So I think it's a well-established fact and study that if you're going to be traveling less, you're going to be changing energy footprint, and you're going to be carbon footprint, and how you're redesigning cities. And we started with Songdo, and I remember we met a lot of urban architects across the world as to how to embed technology as a part of their design and planning. In Songdo, I ran the Songdo project for Cisco. So the whole concept was 20 minutes, you should be able to get from home to school to retail, to your offices, and you should be able to cycle. You never need to drive. And that concept of redesign emerged. And we talked about the economics of how downtowns have emerged because of that, because you don't have the separation of commercial and retail, all that good things. But it's just not enough to redesign the city, but it's also important to think about the policies and frameworks that cities put together to enable that for happening. So we talked about the essential workers and critical workers, everybody getting childcare and support. The question is the teachers who come in and teach these students, what happens if they have COVID? And because they're interacting with so many children, what's the impact to them? So as an entity and an organization, do I force my teacher to come in and teach and get COVID? And then what's the liability and insurance issues around that? I mean, these are practical issues people are going to face every day in this conversation. So there's no way an enterprise or an individual entity is going to solve this. This is where government steps in, because you create policies, you create insurances, you create regulatory frameworks, you create incentives, positive incentives. You bring in NGOs to talk about training, retraining operational processes. You have to bring, so redesigning technology and redesigning cities is the easiest thing. It's the other piece when we have to put all of these together. And then when you think about that in a holistic framework as to how we execute, that's when this is going to evolve. Otherwise, we're going to see some sporadic innovation, and there will be people who will innovate. By the way, we, in my business, we also handle a lot of the universities across the country. And every top university is rethinking their campus. There is no such thing as a campus, existing campus. It's called a hybrid campus environment, where they're going to have people, students studying from all over the place. The courses and curriculums are going to change. That's how, and my wife is a teacher, by the way, and she's been teaching on Zoom classes, and she teaches early childhood. And she's figuring out new ways to tool herself and tool her colleagues to ensure that the children are participative and not have this whole video barrage. How do you have offline activities? How do you get parents a little more involved? And things of that kind. So you're redesigning everything from a process point of view. And I think that's really what is required. It's a process and regulation piece that really needs to go in tandem with technology. Technology and piece is something that already exists. It's the easy part.
Thank you. We're down to our final questions here. I'm going to have one for Jan and Jamira, and then last one for Clive. The one that comes up, speaking of Songdo, Tom Murcott, who worked on that project, asked here about sort of supply chains here. And I'll spin it forward in a sense here, who raises sort of question, which it gets discussed a lot in policy right now about, supply chains coming home, the notion that, so much work was outsourced to the global south, out of developed economies here. And the notion of, should workers be reskilled? Should manufacturing come back to the United States, Canada, and elsewhere? And that's sort of been beyond the scope of our panels here. But yeah, I mean, Jan, Jamira, I'm curious your take on this about, there's been all sorts of essays written about, we need to redevelop in the United States, for example, much more vocational training, thinking about how we build a more, a workforce that looks perhaps more like Germany's with its Mittelstand of family-owned companies and highly educated manufacturing. And also, the fact that all of those supply chains moved manufacturing offshore is why there are so many delivery workers as well. And so, Jan, Jamira, I'm curious your thoughts on what that could look like, I guess, over this next decade here, if particularly global North economies decide that they want to reinvest in training and making at home. You want to come out of mute, or is that all right? Jamira, go ahead.
I'll go first. So what I will say is that I think there is a real desire in regards to opportunity and jobs to bring manufacturing home. I will caution us to realize that a lot of these industries are already going to become obsolete in the next few years due to automation. The fourth industrial revolution is going to bring about an change in so many ways. For instance, in the United States, long drive truck drivers, we're going to lose almost 5 million of those jobs over the next 10 years. And so there is a desire to reskill, not just young people, but also a lot of older folks or more seasoned folks. And I think it needs to be jobs that are skills that needs to be transferable. So critical thinking, tech, entrepreneurship, inter-entrepreneurship are all desirable for a lot of communities. And how do we ensure that folks are able to build and create in their own communities that enables for their communities to grow and not those jobs going outside of those neighborhoods.
Thank you. And Jan, if I could add a wrinkle to that, if you're willing to take it on, is also the role of automation and sort of how you see that going forward. Of course, there's the classic discussion that, there's downward pressure on wages because of outsourcing and also, automation or the looming threat thereof. And so I'm curious how you expect to see that play out, whether then work with labor like Foodora and Delivery Hero have done, whether they'll continue to invest in automation for last mile delivery, robotics, et cetera.
I think a lot of the companies, like she said, are looking forward to try to do automation. But I know with a CUPW, a lot of our workers, like I said before, are postal workers and work in plants where automation has been able to take away some of our jobs. But we ensure that when we do collective bargaining, we have language that ensures us to consult with the employer prior to any kind of automation being put into our workplaces. And with delivering community power, which is our vision for the future, we're talking about expansion of services, creating almost a community hub within the post office, because sometimes you'll find, for example, in the banking sector currently, in Newfoundland, people are traveling 2 days to go to the bank, but they have a post office almost in every city. So therefore, it's important for us to do what's called a just transition as well, which is part of delivering community power, which talks about retraining people in the oil sector, for example, to do different work as we go to a more clean fuel provider for us. as well as I think, around the, we've seen during the COVID-19, the earth has been able to heal itself because a lot of the vehicles are no longer on the road. People are not going out as much anymore. And we see the couriers, they're actually on the bicycles doing this work, riding the bicycles to ensure to help to flatten the curve. So I know in Montreal currently, we're looking at having an electrical bicycle test pilot with one of our employers at Canada Post to see how that will work. So it's really important, I think, for CUPW and other unions as well, to ensure that we have language and collective agreements to be part of the discussion prior to any automation going into any workplace. Because we know it's a reality that's going to happen, but it's important for us to be at the table at the beginning of the conversation, not after it's already been implemented.
Thank you, Jan. And as promised, Clive, the last question for you here, and then we'll see the puppy. I promised everyone we'll see the puppy. So Jamira, I hope you have the puppy standing by. But Clive, as last question to that, I mean, assuming, I guess my question is, there's a couple questions in the audience here about, people who meet their partners at work and about that sort of social side of work, particularly in the office. And I'm curious, how much damage you think has been done to that fabric here. I find it interesting the number of people who openly celebrate the idea that the office may be dead. I mean, I worked from home for 15 years, and yet I spent a lot of time in other people's workplaces and loved actually that sort of openness that was sort of spreading over the last 10 years, the open plan workplace, the rise of co-working and shared workspaces. There seemed to be an acknowledgement that, yeah, the notion of going to a mid-century modern building like Don Draper and spending all of your days locked in a cubicle was a bad thing. But that all seems to have gone back. And I'm curious whether you think that time is gone and we're going to sort of see apprehension and fear for a while, or can we design our way out of that one if there's enough protections? As a designer of offices, I'm curious if you think the romance of the office is dead. Literally.
Oh, I don't believe that at all. Don Draper's life is a great example of why people want to go back to the office. I mean, to create a great movie out of your own life has got to be one of the drivers around what moves us in this world, as much as a fantasy as it might be. No, I think that it's just reframing and reconcentrating on to why we need to be in an office together, which is collaboration. It's social, fundamentally social. It's got nothing to do with rows of desks in a line. It has got to do with participation in creating a social context. And I think more and more we are working with clients, and before this crisis, about how to really present the office as a great resource to the employees. It's to change the nature of the relationship. I heard a very famous developer only the other day saying, an office building is a servant. And this notion that, no, the office building is not the thing that constrains your life. The office building is there to provide a service to you, changes the idea that we should be increasingly participating in shaping that environment. So I'm super optimistic about where everything's going.
Well, I certainly know that after 9 weeks in self-quarantine here, I would certainly like to go to another place away from my family to work. That would be nice to go to a place that is designed for me to work in and not my basement. But that itself is, of course, a luxury. We're at time, and I want to salute the diehards who stay here to the very end because, as promised, Shamira, please present the puppy.
This is Mickey. Hi.
We should all be so blessed to have such a coworker. Well, with that, a round of virtual applause for our panelists. I have a few more housekeeping notes here before we conclude. Michael, if you want to take some slides here. I want to thank Manish and his colleagues at Cisco who were kind enough to, of course, be members of NewCities and to bring this session to you. And then finally, I want to plug for next week. We talked just in passing about sort of the fact that, yeah, that nature is healing, as they say. Nature is healing. We are the virus, goes the meme. But yeah, we're going to talk next week about decarbonization, climate adaptation, and the recognition, of course, that when this crisis is over, we will return to our much longer crisis, which is, of course, climate change. And this has been somewhat of a dress rehearsal for the sacrifices and the collaboration and the breakthroughs that we will need, of course, to decarbonize the world. And I hope you'll all join us again next week for that. But once again, I'd like to thank our guests, Clive and Manish and Jan and Jamira, for joining us to discuss the how, what, and where of work. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Greg and NewCities. That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all in the audience. Have a lovely day. We'll see you soon.
Stay safe, everybody.
Yeah.